Good evening. I'm Pastor Michelle Brennan, and I am the Family Life Director here at First United Methodist Church in Jamestown, North Dakota, and I'm welcoming you to the fourth of 6 sessions of the United Methodist Women's Mission Youth Study, Finding Peace in an Anxious World. And tonight, we will be talking about courage as we continue to look at the Serenity Prayer. Just a couple things before we get started. I want to thank all of you for the affirmations you've been sending us for the music and for the study itself. We estimate that there's between 80 and 100 of you out there watching every week, which has just blown us away because we only thought maybe 40 or 50 would be watching. So you have doubled what we expected, so that's pretty exciting. I want to send a shout out to the UMW in Wahpeton who has identified themselves this past week. And I want to shout out to all of you that continue to watch every single week. I know some of you have watched every single week so far. And so thank you for your support. And thank you to those additional people from Valley City and St. Paul's who have identified themselves this past week. Also want to just give a little bit of a pointer for some of you. Some of the Jamestown First people have talked to me and told me that what they've been doing in order to take notes is either the second time they're watching after the live stream, or if they're watching it for the first time after it's been posted, they are using the pause to pause the video so they can take notes. So if that is helpful, or maybe some of you are already doing that, anyway, a way for you to take notes. Also, someone from St. Paul's told me that they have been using their cell phone to take a photo shot of the screens so that they have the notes that way. And I will try to go slower. I know I'm going too fast. Those of you who know me know that slow is not my deal. I'm always going too fast. And so I will try to slow down some more. By week 6, we should have that figured out. So anyway, as we begin tonight, we begin as we have the last few weeks with the Serenity Prayer. So if we could have that slide, Tyrell, and we will begin with the Serenity Prayer. Let's pray. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you. Since we're talking about courage tonight, I want us to start by having you take a moment and write down the most courageous thing you've ever done. Just take a few minutes to quickly write down the most courageous thing you've ever done, and then later you'll be talking about it with your discussion buddy, but most courageous thing you've ever done. When we think of courage, we generally think of heroic courage. We think of heroes who put their life on the line. We think of military personnel who put their life on the line for their country. We think of heroic courage when we think of police and firemen and first responders who put their life on the line for their community. And in recent days with the coronavirus, when we think of heroic courage, we think of healthcare providers and workers in grocery stores and Walmart, or takeout food and delivery services, or people working in food processing plants, in particular meat processing plants, as we've been hearing a lot in the news, and all different essential services workers who are putting their life on the line in this crisis. But our main text, and also in the book Gifts of Imperfection and in Age of Overwhelm, we read about another kind of courage that's called ordinary courage. And we have a slide for that. Ordinary courage. Ordinary courage is putting our vulnerability on the line. And we'll be talking about ordinary courage tonight, putting our vulnerability on the line. Thank you. Sometimes Anxiety causes us to overfunction or underfunction. Sometimes anxiety causes us to bluster our way through with a false confidence. If you've ever noticed a cat that gets startled and how they puff up and turn sideways to look bigger than they really are and appear really fierce, but the truth is that cat is scared, and yet she or he looks so tough, all puffed up. And sometimes we're just like a cat that is frightened. We puff up with false confidence to bluster our way through. Other times when we're anxious, we deflect, or we lay blame, or we make excuses. And sometimes in the face of anxiety, we show ordinary courage. And we have a slide that shows and gives examples of what ordinary courage looks like. And this is what ordinary courage looks like. We show ordinary courage when we admit we don't know and we seek wisdom. We show ordinary courage when we ask for help and admit we have limitations. We show ordinary courage when we show our true selves and we're authentic and we're real. We show ordinary courage when we take responsibility for things, or when we take the risk of being honest. We show ordinary courage when we trust and discern and rest in God. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to write those down. Ordinary courage. We admit we don't know. We ask for help. We show our true selves. We take responsibility. We take the risk of honesty. We trust. We discern. We rest in God. Thank you, Tyrell. While it's true that true wisdom, which we're going to talk about next week, is about humility, true courage is about risking vulnerability. And if you had a chance to watch Brene Brown's YouTubes on the power of vulnerability or blame or setting boundaries, you know that it takes a lot of courage to take responsibility or to set boundaries. And sometimes we realize we are more courageous than we think we are. If you have ever gone to apologize or make amends for something and you had no idea what the response was going to be, and you had literally exposed your underbelly in doing so, that was courage. That was risking your vulnerability. Or if you have ever challenged or confronted hurtful words or actions, or refused to continue enabling someone in their choices and risk their retaliation, that was courage. That was risking vulnerability. And so I want you to take a moment now and write down a time where you put your vulnerability on the line by taking responsibility or by setting a boundary. And again, you'll be talking about that with your discussion buddy, but just take a moment to write down a time you put your vulnerability on the line by taking responsibility or setting a boundary. Our biblical application tonight comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 9. And it's a story about a man who was born blind. And one day, Jesus and the disciples come across this man who'd been born blind. And the disciples ask Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, because he's born blind? Who's at fault here? And Jesus says, well, neither is at fault. But here's an opportunity to bring glory to God. Isn't that kind of our default setting? To pass judgment or to lay blame? And yet Jesus says, no one's at fault here. And then Jesus heals the man and promptly gets into trouble because he healed someone on the Sabbath, because he worked on the Sabbath. Getting into trouble is not an uncommon thing when you show ordinary courage. So the religious leaders call the blind man in, and they interrogate him. And they try to intimidate this man into saying that Jesus is some sort of a sinner because he worked on the Sabbath, because he violated that law. And the man says, well, Jesus must be some kind of a prophet, because how else could he have healed me? Well, the religious leaders are having none of it. And so they call in the blind man's parents, and they try to intimidate them. And so they ask the parents, who of course are anxious because word has gone out that anybody who supports Jesus or believes Jesus or considers him a holy man is out of the synagogue. And so they call in his parents, and they ask them, is this your son? Yes. Was he born blind? Yes. How can it be that he can now see? And then, in classic anxious deflection, the parents say, we don't know, ask him. So they call the man in again. And when intimidating doesn't work, they turn to shaming him. And they try to shame him. And yet the man stands his ground. And he asks them, well, if this is not a man of God, how is it that he could heal me? Which makes them even angrier. And yet, no matter how angry these religious leaders get, even retaliating by throwing him out, the formerly blind man just keeps speaking his truth. And he says, I don't know if Jesus is a sinner. I don't know who this Jesus is. But I only know that I was blind, and now I can see. This man is a great example of ordinary courage. He admits that he doesn't know when they badger him. He is honest, and he speaks his truth even in the face of being shamed. And he puts his trust in God when they threaten him. And so I'm going to ask you to take a moment again and write down a time that you got into trouble because you told your truth. Write down a time you got into trouble because you told your truth. Being vulnerable, being real, taking risks, changing the things that we have the power to change. That is ordinary courage. And I want to share with you a quote tonight from a famous speech by Theodore Roosevelt, a speech that was given April 23rd, 1910 in Paris, France. And the speech is called Citizenship in a Republic. And if you Google it, you can see the whole speech. But before this quote that I'm going to share with you, Roosevelt in the speech had railed at people who look down on those who try to make the world a better place. And he said, the poorest way to look at life is with a sneer. The poorest way to look at life is with a sneer. And as I pondered that, I got to thinking, well, there is a difference between being practical and being realistic. and being a naysayer who almost cheers for people to fail. It's a poor way to look at life if we look at it with a sneer. Roosevelt went on to say that a cynical habit of thought and speech, a readiness to criticize work which the critic never tries to perform, an intellectual aloofness which will not accept contact with life's realities, are marks not of superiority, but of weakness. And as I pondered that, it made me think about the attitude that we have had in recent years towards school teachers before the coronavirus. And yet now we are discovering a new appreciation for teachers. A new appreciation is beginning to emerge as we realize what it takes to educate our children and youth. And so here is the quote that I want to share with you this evening. It's called "The Man in the Arena," and you've probably heard it before. But it speaks to what ordinary courage is. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man or woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself or herself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he or she fails, at least he or she fails while daring greatly, so that his or her place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. So finding peace in an anxious world means we accept the things we cannot change, and we put our vulnerability on the line, and we step into the arena, and we change the things we can. Even though we may not succeed, even though we may get into trouble, yet because we have the confidence of wisdom, which we're going to talk about next week, we move forward with courage. And so next week, we will talk about wisdom and knowing the difference between what we should accept and what we should change. And now it's time for our telephone buddy questions and 2 hints about our sign-off song for this evening. So we'll start with the first hint for our sign-off song. And this is a hymn. And just as most people can name the classical composer Beethoven, most people also can name the composer Bach. And just like we matched last week, Moonlight Sonata, with "Oh, the Deep, Deep Love of Jesus," tonight we will match a piece from Bach with this well-known hymn, which is sung during the season of Lent. It often appears on Ash Wednesday, or Maundy Thursday, or Good Friday, as we look upon the instrument of Jesus' suffering and sacrifice. If you think you might know that hymn, write it down. As we look upon the instrument of Jesus' suffering and sacrifice. And now it's time for our discussion buddy questions. We already kind of talked about it a little bit. The first one is to share the 3 experiences that you wrote down about courage, which were: what was the most courageous thing you've ever done? When have you put your vulnerability on the line? And when have you gotten into trouble for telling the truth, your truth? So, number 1, share those 3 experiences with courage that you wrote down. And then number 2, where do you need to practice ordinary courage now? Where do you need to practice ordinary courage now? Thank you, Tyrell. And of course, as always, if you have feedback or questions, you can email me at michellebrennan@hotmail.com. And one more assignment for next week. If you haven't had a chance to look at the animated Proverbs YouTube that was listed in the bibliography, or don't have access to that information, here is the address for that YouTube. It's about 8 minutes long, and it gives an excellent context and background for the book of Proverbs, for when we discuss it a little bit more in depth next week. So this is the address, that if you type that in, it should come right up. And that address is youtube.com/watch lowercase v equals capital A lowercase zm capital Y capital V the number 8 and then capital letters GNAIM. Thank you, Tyrell. And now hit number 2 for our sign-off song this evening. As I said, this hymn often appears on Ash Wednesday and Maundy, Thursday, or Good Friday, as we look upon the instrument of Jesus' suffering and sacrifice. As we as Christians look upon this instrument, we consider it a wondrous sight to behold. A wondrous sight to behold. Did you guess when I survey the wondrous cross, which in our United Methodist hymnal is 298 or 299, when I survey the wondrous cross? I want to say thank you to Tyrell Schlecht, our tech person this evening. And again, thank you to Meredith Meidinger and Brittany Heim as they play for us this duet, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, with Air by Bach. Until next time, stay safe.